Hello everyone, welcome to Cashcroft TV. My name is Kalen Ashcroft. Thank you very much for watching and or listening to this episode of Ages of Empires, where we will be going through all the major world empires throughout history. This is episode 72, so it happens to actually be the last episode of this series, but feel free to not watch these in order. It's been quite a journey. We have at least over 70 hours of just recording time, so it's been quite the journey. I never thought we'd make it this far, but we have, so thank you very much for your support. So in this episode, this final episode, we'll be covering the Empire of Japan and the Belgian Colonial Empire. And as well as with all other episodes, we will highlight a specific leader from each empire. So from the Empire of Japan, we will highlight Emperor Meiji. And from the Belgian Colonial Empire, we will highlight King Leopold II. So this is also, I think, an interesting episode because it kind of combines with our World War II history of our Axis powers. For example, we had the German and the Italian Axis powers previously, but we've also covered many colonial empires as well, such as the English, the Dutch, the Portuguese, the Spanish. So this Belgian is the last as well to fit in with that history as well. So I hope this is an exciting episode, and in the end we will have a comparison between the two leaders in the style of Plutarch's Parallel Lives. In Plutarch's Parallel Lives he would have an ancient Greek and an ancient Roman, and then he'd have a comparison in pairs to hopefully learn a bit more about the individuals, and also by doing this comparison hopefully we'll learn a bit more about the empires as well. So without further ado, we will begin with the first empire. So the Empire of Japan, which lasted from 1868 until 1947, experienced dramatic transformations from its rise as an isolated feudal society to one of the world's most powerful empires. So as with all these episodes, we'll seek to find the rise and the fall, also inspired in part by Shearer's Rise and Fall of the Third Reich, but also more generally the decline and fall of the Roman Empire. So we hope to find out why maybe a society or empires today might succeed and fail, so we can extrapolate and hopefully have takeaways for the modern application. So the trajectory of this Empire of Japan from a regional power to a major imperial force was marked by modernization, militarization, and ultimately its catastrophic defeat in World War II, as we've alluded to in the previous episodes. The history of Japan is Japan's imperial rise and fall encompasses the complex dynamics of internal reform, expansionism, and global conflict. So for some background information first, so the Empire of Japan, also known as the Japanese Empire or Imperial Japan, was a nation-state that existed from the Meiji Restoration, whom we'll highlight Emperor Meiji in a specific biography, on the 3rd of January 1868 until the Constitution of Japan ending the empire took effect on the 3rd of May 1947. From 1910 to 1945, it included the Japanese archipelago, the Kurils, the Karafuto, Korea, North and South Korea, Taiwan as well, and many various islands in Oceania as well, as we shall see. Concessions such as Kwantung leased territory were de jure not parts of the empire but dependent territory, so not all of it. As we'll see in the map later, some of the areas are more closely held in terms of control. In the closing stages of the Second World War, with Japan defeated alongside the rest of the Axis powers, that being Germany and Italy, the formalized surrender was issued on the 2nd of September 1945 in compliance with the Potsdam Declaration of the Allies. And the empire's territory subsequently shrunk to cover only the Japanese archipelago, resembling modern Japan. So this was a period when Japan was much larger, at least geographically. So for the rise as to why did this Empire of Japan come to being, starting with the Meiji Restoration and modernization in 1868. So Japan's rise as an imperial power began with the Meiji Restoration in 1868. For centuries, Japan had been under the rule of the Tokugawa Shogunate, a feudal military government that had isolated Japan from the outside world. So there's often interesting idea is that Japan is also so unique because it was isolated and they actively prevented foreigners from intervening or influencing their society, particularly during this period. However, Western imperial powers, particularly the United States, forced Japan to open its doors in the mid-19th century, so unleashing this sort of isolated, distinct culture that had developed, leading to the Treaty of Kanagawa in 1854 and the eventual end of the Tokugawa shogunate. In 1868, marking the starting year of this empire, a coalition of powerful samurai overthrew the shogunate and restored the emperor to the throne under the banner of the Meiji emperor. So the emperor reclaims the throne and forms the Empire of Japan, as it is formally called, in the year of 1868. This marked the beginning of a profound transformation. Therefore, also with these relationships, such as with the United States, Japan adopted Western technologies, institutions, and military techniques in a bid to become competitive with the industrialized powers of Europe and North America, as we shall see more about, for example, its parliament. This period of rapid modernization, known as the Meiji Restoration, which lasted from 1868 to the early 20th century, was a period of rapid growth for this empire. Japan's military, political, and economic systems were fundamentally restructured, and the country built a modern industrial economy and military as well, and created a centralized government and enacted reforms in education, legal systems, and infrastructure. It seemed to be a common theme across our empires, even dating back to those of Egypt. In their rise period, there do tend to be centralization periods, and then the lack of centralization is often a cause of decline, as we might see. This rapid period of modernization is known, once again, as the Meiji Restoration. Japan's military, political, and economic systems were fundamentally restructured as well. Japan's successful modernization allowed it to retain its sovereignty and to avoid the fate of other Asian nations which were being colonized by Western powers, as we've highlighted by many of our colonial powers, for example. And as we shall see, even with the Belgian Empire, which claimed a piece of in Tianjin in China as well. As for the early expansionism, the Sino-Japanese War, particularly from 1894 to 1895, as part of the modernization efforts, Japan sought to increase its influence in Asia. The first major step in its imperial expansion came with the First Sino-Japanese War from 1894 to 1895 against China. So a big key factor, but not necessary for empires, is geographical expansion. And this is what they did, particularly in China. Japan's victory over China marked the first time an Asian power had defeated a Western-style imperial power. Had defeated a Western-style imperial power, and the war resulted in Japan gaining control over Taiwan and other territories in the Pacific, demonstrating its newfound military strength and signaling its intention to expand. So, had they been unsuccessful in this first attempt, maybe they would not have continued in the way that they had. Next came the Russo-Japanese War from 1904 to 1905. Japan's imperial ambition next clashed with Russia in the Russo-Japanese War from 1904 to 1905. This conflict arose from both countries' competing interests in Manchuria and Korea. Japan's victory was a stunning achievement, as it was the first time an Asian power had defeated a European nation in modern warfare. Or Russia is considered both in Asia and European, but nonetheless, the Empire of Japan defeated the Russians in this battle. And the war cemented Japan's status as a major world power and led to its annexation of Korea in 1910, establishing a firm foothold in the Asian continent. By the early 20th century, Japan was well on its way to becoming a major imperial power in the Pacific and Asia, coming to the height of its power from 1940 to the 1930s, starting with World War I and the rise of Japan's influence from 1914 to 1918. So often, as we see in the rise and fall structure, as we get to the peak, things necessarily, though, start to decline. Some of our empires have been multimodal, bimodal, have multiple peaks, but this seems to, they kept continuously rising up until the war. and even for a period during the war. So during the First World War, Japan sided with the Allies, using the conflict to expand its influence in East Asia. So they sided with the Allies, who ultimately won the First World War. So perhaps they chose the correct side on the First World War, but incorrect side in the Second World War. Japan seized German-controlled territories in China and the Pacific, solidifying its control over important regions. In China and the Pacific, solidifying important regions in the territorial regions in the Asian continent. While Japan did not play a direct combat role in Europe, its victories allowed it to strengthen its global position and increase its colonial holdings. After the war, Japan was granted a permanent seat on the League of Nations, an international organization founded in 1920 to maintain peace. There's a huge rabbit hole we can go in there with Woodrow Wilson, and for example, Union Now and Clarence Strait, but that's a discussion for another time. Nonetheless, a fascinating precursor, perhaps, to the United Nations, marking its entry into the global diplomatic arena as a recognized power. So after the First World War, they came out even stronger. The war, however, also contributed to growing nationalist sentiment within Japan, which would later feed into more aggressive military and imperial policies. So perhaps they got overconfident, leading them to side perhaps with the nationalists or the Axis powers. As for the 1930s, so once we finally get to our peak coming up to the Second World War, the imperial expansion and the path to war. So the global economic depression in the 1930s affected the whole world. I'm reading currently the Power Broker, and it's fascinating to see that there was also significant depression even in New York as well. So it affected the whole world, this depression, and the Empire of Japan was no different. Japan's leadership began to advocate for creation of the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, a regional bloc that would allow Japan to dominate East Asia free from Western influence. So they started to break their ties with their Western allies and started to want to rule their own sphere. And by doing so, they needed to separate from the Allied powers. In 1931, Japan invaded Manchuria in northeastern China, establishing a puppet state of Manchukuo. This aggressive action, which was carried out by the Japanese military without full approval from the civilian government, marked a key movement in Japan's shift towards imperialism and militarism, so without consent of the people engaging in war. In 1937, Japan launched a full-scale invasion of China, beginning the Second Sino-Japanese War. Japan's military forces inflicted heavy casualties and atrocities on Chinese civilians, most notably in the infamous Nanjing massacre, also known as the Rape of Nanjing, because there were excessive rapes during this period in 1937, where hundreds of thousands of Chinese were killed. As for the Axis powers period and the outbreak of the Second World War from 1940 to 1941, so by the late 1930s, Japan had formed an alliance with the Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy, known as the Axis powers. I highly suggest you watch or I'd be grateful if you watch, and I'm grateful if you have watched my episode on the Empire of Japan, Nazi Germany and the Italian Empire, to learn more about this, signing the Tripartite Pact in 1940 and aligning themselves with the Axis powers. Japan's ambitions expanded further with the occupation of French Indochina, such as Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia in 1940 to 1941, as part of its drive to dominate Southeast Asia. Japan's expansion was viewed as a threat by the United States because they were on opposite sides of the Pacific, so unlike perhaps some of the other threats to the United States, Japan was particularly close, whereas maybe Italy, for example, wouldn't have been as big of a threat to the United States. Japan essentially shared a border, just separated by the Pacific, with the United States. So Japan's ambitions further threatened the United States and other Western powers, leading to economic sanctions and the oil embargo to stop their excessive actions within Asia, and threats towards the United States. In 1941, Japan launched a surprise attack on the United States fleet at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, bringing the United States into World War II. So it's speculated that if Japan had not preemptively attacked Pearl Harbor, maybe the United States wouldn't have entered the war when they did, and maybe that would have given the Axis powers more time to win, but perhaps it was out of necessity that they had to attack Pearl Harbor, and they were already going to lose anyways. Speculation, but nonetheless, that the attack on Pearl Harbor brought the United States into the war, and they had not been in the war at that time. At least from the rise and fall of the Third Reich, I seem to find that the turning point in the war was actually the Battle of Britain. So perhaps the English who perhaps made the turning point, or the Russians. But then came the Americans. I think maybe the war had already started to turn with the British. Then the Russians further solidified this, and then the Americans entering was the final killing blow, or the final ally that necessarily defeated the Axis powers. This was the beginning of the Pacific War, as it is called, a brutal and prolonged conflict that would ultimately lead to Japan's downfall. So as for the fall of this Empire of Japan, from the period of 1941 to 1945. After the attack on Pearl Harbor, Japan swiftly expanded its empire, capturing much of Southeast Asia, the Philippines, and various Pacific islands. However, by 1942, Japan began to face significant resistance from the Allied forces, particularly the United States. Key naval battles such as the Battle of Midway in 1942 turned the tide in favor of the Allies. The United States and its allies began a campaign of island hopping, gradually pushing the Japanese forces back. As the war dragged on, Japan's military and economy were severely strained. The Allied forces, led by the United States, launched devastating air raids, including the fire bombings of Tokyo and the eventual atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August of 1945. I've been to Hiroshima when I was, I think, 2010, many years ago, and it's really quite a sight to see the destruction that man is capable of. These attacks caused us unprecedented devastation and loss of life, including Japan's surrender. It's one image. There's an individual had his hand by the window when the bomb went off, and he started growing nails. He had a mutation. I thought that was fascinating, that radiation can do such a thing to a human. But it also caused perpetual growth of these black nails, and when they would break off, they would bleed. It was very vivid, but also fascinating to see the destructive qualities of atomic bombs. As therefore leading to Japan's surrender and the end of the empire in 1945. In the face of overwhelming destruction and the Soviet Union's declaration of war on Japan, Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender on August 15, 1945, marking the end of the Empire of Japan. The formal surrender took place on September 2, 1945, aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay. As for the post-empire from 1945 to present, following leading up to the occupation of post-war Japan, following Japan's defeat, the country was occupied by Allied forces under the leadership of U.S. General Douglas MacArthur. Japan's imperial system was dismantled, and the country underwent significant political, social, and economic reforms. The Japanese Constitution of 1947, marking the end of the Empire of Japan, officially renounced war and prohibited Japan from maintaining military forces for aggressive purposes, symbolizing the end of its imperial ambitions. I'm reading a book by Richard Nixon, and he notes that in Nixon's time, Japan had once again become a significant economic power, but because of this agreement, they were prevented from becoming a military power, which may have been helpful because they again became an ally with the United States. Furthermore, in the post-war era, Japan focused on rebuilding its economy, eventually becoming one of the world's leading industrialized nations in the 1960s and 1970s. While Japan's imperial empire was gone, the country rebuilt itself as a peaceful, prosperous, and democratic state. So quite a shift from its former behavior during the Second World War as an Axis power and nationalist state, and nationalist enterprising and conquering state. So therefore, the rise and fall of the Empire of Japan is a tale of dramatic transformation from a feudal society to a modern imperial empire, and ultimately to a defeated empire. Japan's imperial ambitions, driven by a desire for regional dominance, led to great achievements, but also to horrific conflicts and atrocities, such as the bombings of Nagasaki and Hiroshima. Its downfall came at the cost of immense destruction and human suffering, but post-war Japan emerged as a peaceful and thriving nation. Perhaps some of the developments in technology that were for military purposes had paid dividends later during their economic prosperity years. Therefore, the legacy of Japan's imperial past continues to shape the country's identity and its relations with its neighbors till this day. It's a very, very fascinating period, a very, very important and large empire as well. So as to highlight a specific leader, we have Emperor Meiji. So Emperor Meiji, born Matsuhito, was the 122nd Emperor of Japan, and is widely regarded as one of the most significant rulers in Japan's modern histories. His reign from 1867 to 1912 marked a period of Japan's dramatic transformation from a feudal society to a modern industrialized nation and a rising imperial power. His leadership through the Meiji Restoration and subsequent era of reforms and expansion fundamentally altered Japan's political, social, and economic structures. Therefore, Emperor Meiji's reign set the foundation for the rise of the Empire of Japan as a global power in the 20th century. So for some background information, Matsuhito was born on the 3rd of November, making him a Scorpio, of 1852, and died on the 20th of July, 1912. Posthumously honored as Emperor Meiji, so he was actually lived his life, known as Matsuhito, was the 122nd Emperor, as mentioned, of Japan according to the traditional order of succession, reigning from 1867 until his death in 1912. His reign is associated with the Meiji Restoration of 1868, which ended the Tokugawa shogunate and began rapid changes that transformed Japan from an isolationist feudal state to an industrialized world power, as we have seen. Emperor Meiji was the first monarch of the Empire of Japan and presided over the Meiji era. So, as for his early life, so Emperor Meiji, once again, was born on November 3rd, 1852, as Matsuhito to Emperor Komei and Empress Tashi, so born from the royal lineage. Some of our leaders have come from royal lineage, some have not. The majority of our most significant leaders tend to come from royal lineage, but many haven't, such as, for example, Napoleon Bonaparte, for example, or Julius Caesar as well. He was born into the Tokugawa shogunate era, a time when Japan was ruled by a feudal military government known as the shogunate, which had limited contact with the outside world, so an isolationist society. Following the policy of isolationism known as Sakoku. As a child, Matsuhito was educated in traditional Confucian and Japanese arts. So Confuci, we have an episode on him as well in our History of Leaders of Thought series. And he was educated in Japanese arts and sciences, and he was expected to become a ceremonial figurehead in a system where the real power was held by Tokugawa shogunate. So although he had maybe one of the best upbringings he could, it wasn't expected that he would come to lead the state during this shogunate period. However, Japan was soon to face profound changes that would shape his future. In 1867, Emperor Komei died unexpectedly, and Matsuhito, at the young age of 14, ascended to the throne as Emperor Meiji. So a surprising turn of events where he becomes emperor. And his reign marked a turning point in Japan's history. Japan was on the verge of profound political, social, and economic changes due to increasing pressures from Western powers, which had begun to force Japan to open its doors for trade and diplomacy. So he marks the shift from isolationism to openism. As for the Meiji Restoration, a new era for Japan, starting with the overthrow of the Tokugawa shogunate. So in 1867, as Emperor Meiji assumed the throne, the Tokugawa shogunate was already in decline. The shogunate had been in power for over 250 years, but Japan's isolation from the global economy and increasing Western influence threatened its traditional government, so it seemed to not be a sustainable way, this isolationism. In the late 1850s and 1960s, foreign pressures, especially from the United States, notably the Perry Expedition in 1853, led Japan to open up to international trade. This undermined the authority of the shogunate and sparked internal strife. Groups within Japan, particularly the southern domains of Choshu and Satsuma, advocated for restoration of imperial power and the modernization of the country. So it's interesting that the imperial power, the imperial royal family, was seen as a freeing element, where often the imperial or the royal families have been sort of binding elements. In 1868, the forces that supported Emperor Meiji defeated the Tokugawa shogunate in the Boshin War, leading to the Meiji Restoration. The shogunate therefore was dissolved and the power of the emperor was restored, signaling the beginning of a new political era under the Emperor Meiji's leadership. This marked the official end of Japan's feudal system and the beginning of rapid modernization and the beginning of the Empire of Japan in 1868. So, as for his reign, modernization and transformation from 1868 to 1912. So the Meiji Constitution and political reforms. So one of the most significant aspects of Emperor Meiji's rule was the introduction of a new political system based on Western models. Under the guidance of Japanese reformers and advisors, Japan adopted a constitutional monarchy in 1889 and parliamentary system in the Meiji Constitution of 1889. This constitution created a central government and with a bicameral legislature, very common. The United States has a bicameral, has the Senate and also House of Representatives, or Congress, pardon me. Canada is bicameral too, has the upper house, the Senate, and also the House of Commons. The United Kingdom also has a bicameral system as well, with the House of Lords and also the House of Commons. So following this sort of Western tradition. This constitution created a central government with a bicameral legislature, known as the Imperial Diet, and established a unified national bureaucracy. Emperor Meiji, while maintaining his symbolic role as a divine monarch, also became the head of state with real powers, particularly in foreign policy and military decisions. The emperor's power, however, was limited to his newly established institutions that focused on modernization and Western-style governance. So not the same absolute authority that maybe the shogunate exercised, but still, nonetheless, the absolute ruler of the state, or the most powerful leader within the state, succeeding some powers to the parliament. As for his economic and industrial reforms, the Meiji government embarked on a series of economic and industrial reforms to modernize Japan. The government invested in infrastructure such as railways, roads, and telegraph lines, and encouraged the development of industries like textile, steel, and shipbuilding, so a period of rapid growth. There's an idea that, for example, third world countries have to start from scratch to grow, but they often get to leapfrog into modern times. So, for example, in many third world countries, they say they went straight to the flat screen TV. They didn't have the smaller TVs first. So after their isolationism, they got jumped ahead a couple levels straight to the most modern technologies. And in some ways that could be better, because then they can build upon it quicker. Therefore, Western experts were brought in also to help modernize the country's economy, while Japan also sent students and diplomats abroad to study Western industrial methods. By the late 19th century, Japan had transformed from an agrarian economy to an industrialized nation, on par with the Western powers in many respects, rapid growth catching up almost precisely to the same level as the Western powers. This economic transformation was a key factor in Japan's subsequent rise as a military and imperial power. As for military reforms and expansionism, Emperor Meiji understood the importance of military strength in securing Japan's place in the world. The Meiji government therefore undertook massive military reforms, adopting Western-style military organizations, technologies, and tactics. Japan created a modern army and navy, which were instrumental in its later imperial conquests. Under Emperor Meiji's leadership, Japan began its first step towards imperial expansion. In 1894 to 1895, Japan fought and won the First Sino-Japanese War against China, gaining control of Taiwan and asserting its influence over Korea. This victory not only demonstrated Japan's military capabilities, but also marked its emergence as an imperial power in East Asia, and a successful one as well. In 1904 to 1905, Japan engaged in the Russo-Japanese War as well, defeating Russia and securing its control over Manchuria and Korea. This was a major achievement, as Japan was the first non-Western power to defeat a major European nation in modern warfare, which further solidified its status as a world power and also instilled fear within some of its competitors as well. As for the legacy of Emperor Meiji from nationalism and modern Japan, Emperor Meiji's reign ended with his death on July 30th, 1912, but his legacy as an architect of Japan's modernization and rise to power endured. The period known as the Meiji era from 1868 to 1912 fundamentally reshaped Japan, turning it into a modern, industrialized, and militarized empire. Through Emperor Meiji's leadership, Japan adopted the values of a constitutional monarchy and a modern economy, aligning itself with Western powers at the time. His ability to navigate the challenges and modernization while retaining Japanese traditions allowed Japan to avoid colonization and emerge as a respected empire in its own right. So also, as mentioned in many of our colonial empires, many of its peers were being colonized, whereas Japan was not only resistant to this, but was colonizing or conquering in its own right, perhaps in large part due to Meiji Restoration. Therefore, the Meiji Emperor's enduring impact. So Emperor Meiji was a pivotal in Japan's transformation from a feudal society to a modern world power. His reforms spanned every aspect of Japanese society, from political and economic systems to military and culture. His reign marked Japan's emergence as an imperial force and set the stage for its later role in World War I and World War II, and its post-war recovery as well. His leadership is often regarded as a key turning point in Japan's history, laying the foundation for the modern nation, and continues to shape global affairs today, the country's global affairs today. Therefore, the Meiji Restoration and the reforms he initiated have left an indelible mark on Japan's national identity, and Emperor Meiji remains one of the most important figures in the history of the Japanese Empire, not to mention its first leader, formally. So, that is Emperor Meiji and the fascinating Empire of Japan, and also the fascinating Emperor Meiji. As for the content of the slide, so title, Emperor Meiji and the Empire of Japan, also known as the Japanese Empire or Imperial Japan, or Dai Nippon Teikoku, or Dai Nihon Teikoku. It was a Japanese nation-state from the Meiji Restoration until the Constitution of Japan. I can read hiragana and katakana, but I don't know the kanji characters as well, but I know that it means Empire of Japan. As for a significant leader, we highlighted was Matsuhito, Emperor Meiji. Empire was Imperial Japan. Period was from 1868 to 1947, CE, Common Era, under the Meiji era, the Taisho era, and the Showa era, the three eras of the Empire of Japan. Modern locations included Japan, South Korea, North Korea, Taiwan, parts of China, Philippines, Burma, Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, Micronesia, the Mariana Islands, the Solomon Islands, Vanuatu, Kiribati, Palau, and Indonesia. Million square kilometers was 8.51, so very, very large empire as well. Because our average empire size of all the largest empires throughout history is 1.14, so significantly larger. Million square miles equivalent would be 3.285. Percent of the world would be 6.32%, excluding Antarctica. As for capital was Kyoto from 1868 to 1869, a beautiful traditional city I've been fortunate to visit, and Tokyo as well, a bustling, massive metropolis as well from 1869 to 1947. The city I've also been fortunate to visit and endeavor to return to. Government was a unitary absolute monarchy from 1868 to 1889, and a unitary parliamentary semi-constitutional monarchy from 1889 to 1947. During the war period, however, though, it was largely run by the military. Common language was, of course, Japanese. The religion, the de jure, was a secular state, so they even tried to burn down at one point many of the religious sites to try to remove religion, but there was still the de facto religion known as the state Shinto. The population was 77,700,000 in 1920 and up to 105,200,000 in 1940. So it's near its population even till this day. As for images, in the top left, we have a portrait by Uchida Koichi in 1873 of Emperor Meiji himself. To the right of that, we have the flag of Japan. The border is not actually part of it, but I had to put a black border just so you could see the white background. Otherwise, it would have just been a red dot in the middle of the screen. It's known as it's representative of the sun, which I think is fitting because the sun rises in the east and sets in the west. I have a philosophy that to move, let's say you have a farm and you keep moving east, you're sort of chasing the sun because you're chasing the sunrise. But then once you get to Japan, you can't really go any further. So it makes sense that it's the land of the rising sun. To the right of that, we also have the imperial seal. To the right of that, we have the empire. We have on the far right, we maybe do the map. First, we have the Empire of Japan at its greatest territorial extent in 1942. The dark green are its colonies, and the light green are its puppet states, protectorates, and occupied territories. So we have the flag of Japan, the seal of Japan, and to the right of that we have the Tokyo Industrial Exhibition in 1907, so showing that it was now an open state, emphasizing that, but also showing a little image of what Tokyo and what the dress might have looked like at the time. Below that, we have the interior of the Japanese Parliament, or the Diet, showing the Prime Minister speaking, addressing the House of Peers in 1915. So once again, noting it's got a bicameral system with an upper house known as the House of Peers and a lower house known as the House of Representatives. So bicameral, but they also maintained an emperor as well, so a constitutional monarchy. Not so different perhaps from the United Kingdom itself during this time. And to the right, we have some final information. So the Meiji Restoration started in the 3rd of January, 1868. The Meiji Constitution was ratified in the 11th of February, 1889. The First Sino-Japanese War was on the 25th of July, 1894, marking its territorial ambitions. The Russo-Japanese War, which also resulted in a success, was on the 8th of February, 1904. World War I began on 23rd of August, 1914. For them, the Mukden incident was on the 18th of September, 1931, an important event as well. The Second Sino-Japanese War was on the 7th of July, 1937, is when it began. The founding of the IRAA was on the 12th of October, 1940. The World War II began on the 7th of December, 1941, or that's when they entered the war. And the surrender of Japan with the Axis powers. Surrender of Japan took place on the 2nd of September, 1945, and it was reconstituted on the 3rd of May, 1947. So that is the fascinating, in my opinion, Emperor Meiji and the Empire of Japan. So Emperor Meiji and the Empire of Japan. Hopefully we'll learn more about the emperor and the empire in the comparison with King Leopold II after covering as well the Belgian Colonial Empire. So the rise and fall, once again, we'll structure the rise and fall to see why empires and societies might rise and succeed and fail today. So the rise and fall of the Belgian Colonial Empire. So the Belgian Colonial Empire was one of the smaller European colonial empires. We covered the British, the Dutch, the Spanish, and the Portuguese. So rounding out our colonial empires. Yet it had significant impact on the history of Central Africa. It was marked by exploitation, humanitarian abuses, and international scrutiny. The history of the Belgian colonialism is primarily centered around the Congo Free State and later the Belgian Congo, which lasted from the late 19th century until the mid-20th century. So for some background information, Belgium controlled several territories and concessions during the colonial era, principally the Belgian Congo, modern-day Democratic Republic of the Congo, from 1908 to 1960, the Urundi, modern-day Rwanda and Burundi, from 1922 to 1962, and the Lado Enclave, which is in modern-day Central Equatorial provinces of South Sudan, from 1884 to 1910. It also had small concessions in Guatemala from 1843 to 1845, and Belgian concessions in Tianjin Tianjin in China from 1902 to 1931 and was co-administrator of the Tangier International Zone in Morocco. So, as for the rise of this Belgian colonial empire from 1885 to 1910, so the birth of the Belgian colonialism with King Leopold II, who we'll highlight in specific biography to come, and the Congo Free State. So Belgium was one of the last European powers to establish a colonial empire, largely because it was a small, newly independent country, as we shall see, after gaining independence from the Netherlands in 1830. By the 1870s, Belgium's King Leopold II was determined to expand his influence abroad, particularly in Africa. In 1884 to 1885, the Belgian Conference was held to regulate European colonization and trade in Africa, and during this time Leopold was able to secure personal control over a large portion of Central Africa, which was called the Congo Free State. So this is a great book by Michael Doyle about the scramble for Africa, sort of dividing it up between many different European powers. And the Congo Free State was one which the Belgian colonial empire gained. While the international community formally recognized the Congo Free State as a personal possession of King Leopold II, not part of the Belgian state, so it was actually King Leopold himself's personal estate, not the Belgians necessarily, he was able to present it as a humanitarian endeavor aimed at abolishing the slave trade and spreading Christianity, so ostensibly for good purpose. However, the reality of the Congo Free State was brutal. Leopold ran the colony as a personal enterprise, extracting rubber, ivory, and other resources from the land. To do so, he established a ruthless regime that exploited the territories and terrorized local populations. The indigenous peoples were forced into labor, and those who failed to meet quotas for rubber collection were often punished with mutilations, executions, and other forms of extreme violence. So, some of our colonial empires have been better and some have been worse, but many of them were quite bad. But Belgian colonial empire did do many significant atrocities. As for humanitarian outrage and international response, the atrocities in the Congo eventually attracted global attention, particularly through the efforts of the British and American missionaries and activists. So it's even appalling to those countries which had, for example, the United States had a history of slavery, for example, and it was appalling to them. And the scale of suffering which is estimated to have, but maybe because they have that history of slavery, then maybe that made them accommodate and maybe turned around the other way and focus on addressing atrocities, perhaps as a form of apology. And the scale of suffering, which is estimated to have caused deaths of up to 10 million people, about half of the Congo's population at the time, led to widespread outrage. By the early 1900s, campaigns against Leopold's rule intensified, culminating in the pressure of public opinion and diplomatic channels. In 1908, after years of pressure, Leopold was forced to cede control of the Congo Free State, and it became known as the Belgian Congo. And therefore the Belgian government, for his personal losses, Leopold was relinquished, therefore he relinquished personal control, but he was compensated by the Belgian government for his personal losses, and he continued to profit from the exploitation of the Congo's resources. So it's a history of King Leopold II really abusing this territory and then eventually giving it to his state, the Belgian colonial empire, and he even gets paid for it and continued to profit from it nonetheless. As for the high point, the peak of the Belgian colonial empire from 1910 to 1950, with the Belgian Congo under the Belgian government. Under direct Belgian rule, the Congo remained as a source of immense wealth for Belgium. However, despite reforms aimed at improving conditions in the colony, exploitation remained at the core of the Belgian presence. The government established large-scale infrastructure projects including railroads, ports, and mines to extract resources like copper, diamonds, and rubber. While some investments in education and healthcare were made, they were limited to and often only benefited the white expatriate community. So once again, even after moving into the Belgian state rather than King Leopold II's personal holdings, it was still engaged in abuses. Therefore, the Belgian colonial regime maintained its control through a system of segregation and paternalism. Indigenous people were kept in subordinate positions, and the Belgian authorities controlled all political and economic activities. Therefore, the Belgian colonists enjoyed considerable privileges with a small minority of white settlers living in relative comfort, while the majority of the population lived in extreme poverty and oppression. As for the rise of nationalism and demand for independence, so by the mid-20th century, a growing wave of decolonization swept across Africa, driven by nationalist movements seeking to independence from European colonial powers. There's many of the colonies, colonial empires started to deconstruct at this period. In the Belgian Congo, the first stirrings of resistance appeared in the 1950s. Political organizations began to form, advocating for greater representation, rights, and eventual full independence. In response, the Belgian government reluctantly introduced some reforms, allowing for limited self-government in 1957. However, the reform process was too slow and insufficient to meet the aspirations of the Congolese people, leading to increasing frustration and protests, therefore leading to the fall of the Belgian colonial empire. So with the speed of independence in the Congo crisis. So the turning point came in 1960 when, under increasing international pressure and momentum of the broader African independence movement, Belgium finally agreed to grant Congo independence. On June 30th, 1960, the Congo became an independent Republic of the Congo, with Patrice Lumumba as the first prime minister and Joseph Kasavubu as president. Therefore, the Belgian king at the time, Baudouin, gave an emotional speech during the independence ceremony, but it was overshadowed by Lumumba's fiery address, which included a condemnation of Belgium's colonial abuses. Therefore, the transition to independence was shockingly abrupt, as the Belgian government had done little to prepare the Congolese people for self-rule. So, although maybe they did need to break off eventually, maybe it was a bit abrupt, or there could have been some better baton pass, some more effective transition for self-rule. And the country therefore faced deep political and social challenges, including the underdeveloped infrastructure, limited education, and ethnic division. The sudden withdrawal of Belgian personnel left a vacuum, and the newly formed Congolese government struggled to establish control. Therefore, within weeks of independence, chaos erupted. There was political infighting, military mutinies, and widespread violence. Lumumba, whose vision of independence was at odds with both Belgian government and local political elites, was ousted and imprisoned in September 1960. Therefore, Lumumba was executed under mysterious circumstances with Belgian complicity. Therefore, for Belgium's post-colonial relations, Belgium's handling of the Congo's transition to independence left a lasting legacy of bitterness. The Belgian government had acted in its own interest and failed to adequately prepare the colony for self-rule, which contributed to decades of political instability in the Congo. The chaos and violence that followed the independence plunged the country into what became known as the Congo Crisis, a series of conflicts that ultimately led to the dictator Mobutu Sese Seko in 1965. Therefore, Belgium's colonial legacy continued to haunt the Congo long after independence. Economic exploitation, political manipulation, and human rights abuses were among the enduring impacts of the Belgian rule. While some Belgians later acknowledged the crimes committed during the colonial period, others remained in denial or justified the imperial experience as a civilizing mission. Therefore, the Belgian colonial empire was relatively short-lived, but left a deep and lasting legacy on the Congo. The rise of the Belgian colonialism in Africa was driven by the personal ambition of King Leopold II, who we'll highlight in a specific biography, and the quest for economic gain, while its fall was the result of both internal struggles with the Congo and the broader decolonization movement sweeping across the African continent. The brutal history of exploitation and the Congo's turbulent path to independence remains defining elements of the legacy of the Belgian colonialism. Despite some efforts by Belgium to acknowledge its past, the scars of its colonial era continue to affect the relationship between Belgium and the Democratic Republic of the Congo, with ongoing discussions about reparations and accountability for the atrocities committed during this dark chapter in history. So it's not necessarily the size of a colonial empire that determines the degree of the atrocities. They had largely one major holding, the Belgian Congo, but they also had Tianjin, for example, in Guatemala, but nonetheless, and some of Rwanda and Burundi, but it wasn't the largest colonial empire, but in terms of impact and lasting impact is still significant. For example, the DRC, Democratic Republic of the Congo, still faces some difficulties, and perhaps it was in large part due to the Belgian colonial empire period. So as to highlight a specific leader, King Leopold II, one of the most significant leaders of the Belgian colonial empire, and particularly the region of the Congo. So King Leopold II of Belgium is widely considered the most significant, though most deeply controversial figure in the history of the Belgian colonial empire. His reign from 1865 to 1909 was marked by his personal control over the Congo Free State, a private colony that became infamous for its brutal exploitation and human rights abuses. Leopold's colonial ambitions and the legacy of its actions in Africa have cast a long and painful shadow over Belgian history, with the consequences of his rule still resonating today. So for the quick background information, so King Leopold II was born on the 9th of April, 1835, I believe that makes Aries, or an Aries, yes, and died on the 17th of December, 1909. And was the second king of Belgium from 1865 to 1909, and the founder and the sole owner of the Congo Free State from 1885 to 1908, a year before his death. As for his early life and ascension to the throne, so Leopold II was born on April 9th, 1835 in Brussels, Belgium, as the second son of King Leopold I. So he was the second son, not necessarily the first in line, and the first and his father was the first king of Belgium and Queen Louise Marie of France. Leopold was educated in a manner befitting a future monarch, attending military school and gaining an understanding of European politics, diplomacy, and governance. So he was sort of being groomed for leadership. In 1865, Leopold ascended to the throne of Belgium after the death of his father. His reign began in a period of political stability for Belgium, but Leopold quickly became focused on his vision for creating a colonial empire, which he believed would enhance Belgium's status in the world, to perhaps maybe compete with the Dutch colonial empire, for example, which formerly they attained their independence from, or the British colonial empire, but also other Europeans with their colonial empires. Maybe he was inspired or competitive, wanted to compete by having his own colonial empire. So as for colonial ambitions and the birth of the Congo Free State, his dreams of empire, the search for a colony. So although Belgium was relatively small, newly established nation in Europe, Leopold II was determined to expand his influence beyond its borders. Belgium was surrounded by larger European powers, and Leopold saw colonial expansion as a means of securing national prestige and wealth. For example, the British, they're confined to the British Isles, but they expanded significantly over the high seas. Inspired by the imperial ambitions of other European nations, he sought a colony that would be both profitable and prestigious to Belgium. Therefore, Leopold initially turned to Africa, where European powers were increasingly engaging in the so-called scramble for Africa during the late 19th century. In particular, he was captivated by the potential for a vast and unexplored Congo River basin in Central Africa. As for the creation of the Congo Free State in 1885, so Leopold's pursuit of African colonization was driven by both a desire for wealth and a sense of European mission. At the time, European powers were engaging in imperialism under the guise of spreading civilization and Christianity. So ostensibly for these regions, maybe he genuinely did want to believe Christianity, but extend Christianity or European influence or civilization, but given the effects of what he did, it seems like he might have had other motives, such as exploitation. Therefore, Leopold presented his plans for Africa as a humanitarian effort, promising to bring an end to the slave trade and promote economic development. In 1867, he formed the International African Association, ostensibly a philanthropic organization aimed at promoting exploration and trade in Central Africa. However, Leopold's true objective was to secure control over the Congo. Through a mix of diplomacy, coercion, and manipulation of international players, he managed to acquire personal sovereignty over a vast swath of land in the Congo River basin. Therefore, in 1885, the Congo Free State was officially recognized as personal property of King Leopold II, making him the sole ruler of this vast territory. About 80 times the size of Belgium, so very, very large as well. The Congo Free State was not a colony of Belgium, but a private holding of Leopold, who exercised control over its governance and resources, so even relatively more control in the Congo than he had within his own country, as a personal holding. As for exploitation and atrocities of the Congo, as alluded to, with economic exploitation, the rubber trade. So Leopold's primary motivation in acquiring the Congo was the economic potential it offered. The Congo was rich in natural resources, particularly rubber, which had become a highly profitable commodity in the late 19th century due to the development of the automobile industry in Europe and North America, for tires, for example. Leopold implemented a system of forced labor that extracted rubber from indigenous populations at an unimaginable cost. The Congolese people were forced to meet quotas for rubber collection, and failure to comply was met with brutal punishment. The most infamous form of punishment was the severing of hands, often hands of children and non-compliant villagers. So they'd cut off their hands so they wouldn't work sufficiently. They'd entirely remove their means to work. Often hands of children as well and non-compliant villagers. This horrifying practice was meant to instill fear and ensure the Congolese people met their rubber quotas. So if they cut off few people's hands, those who maintain their hands might feel obliged to work even harder. So they're an atrocious form of coercion. As for the systematic abuse and human rights violations, under Leopold's rule, the indigenous populations of the Congo suffered tremendously. It is estimated that between 10 and 15 million people died due to direct violence, starvation, and disease, and the brutal conditions imposed by the rubber trade. The Congolese population was subjected to extreme violence, including massacres, mutilations, and torture. Leopold's private army, the Force Publique, as it's called, was responsible for enforcing, or the public force, was responsible for enforcing the rubber quotas, often through extreme violence. The Force Publique committed numerous atrocities, including the burning of villages, the enslavement of children, and the killing of anyone who resisted exploitation. As for international outcry and exposure, so the inhumane conditions in the Congo eventually became known to the outside world, thanks in part due to the efforts of missionaries. So some people who were spreading religion did have a positive effect, but at least not in the case of King Leopold II. As well, journalists and human rights activists began to take notice. One of the most notable figures in exposing the atrocities was E.D. Morel, a British journalist and activist who documented the exploitation of the Congo. His efforts, along with those of other campaigners, led to an international outcry against Leopold's regime. As for the Congo Reform Association, founded in 1904, played a pivotal role in the mobilization of public opinion in Europe and America, the United States, calling for the end of the abuses of the Congo Free State. Pressure mounted on Leopold, and by 1908, after years of condemnation and diplomatic pressure, Leopold was forced to cede control of the Congo Free State to the Belgian government. But as we have seen, although things slightly improved under Belgian government rule rather than King Leopold II's direct rule, it still had a lot of atrocities and problems. Therefore, the end of the King Leopold's rule and the Congo legacy. So with the Belgian Congo in 1908. So in 1908, King Leopold II was forced to transfer control of the Congo Free State to the Belgian government, as mentioned, and the colony became known as the Belgian Congo. Although Leopold officially relinquished control, he was firstly financially compensated from the transfer, and the Belgian government promised reforms, but the legacy of Leopold's reign continued to haunt the region, and he still managed to claim some economic benefits even, so he got paid for it, and he still exerted some control and gains from this region. While Belgium's direct rule over the Congo lasted for several decades and saw some infrastructural improvements, the exploitation of the Congo's resources continued. The Congo's vast natural wealth, particularly minerals, was extracted for the benefit of Belgian and Western corporations, with little improvement in the living conditions for the Congolese people. Therefore, Leopold II's reign in the Congo would become synonymous with colonial exploitation and cruelty. Though Belgium would eventually grant Congo independence in 1960, the country's colonial legacy, shaped by Leopold II's atrocities, remains a contentious and painful issue in both Belgian and Congolese history. So for the death and legacy of Leopold II passed away on December 17, 1909, leaving behind him a legacy of one of the most brutal colonial regimes in history. His reign is remembered primarily for the vast human suffering caused by the exploitation of the Congo. He is sometimes viewed in Belgium as a modernizer who brought infrastructure and developments to his country. His legacy is forever marred by his actions in Africa. In recent decades, there have been increasing acknowledgement of the atrocities committed by Leopold's rule. In Belgium, statues of Leopold have been defaced and even removed, and public debates have arisen for the need for Belgium to confront its colonial past. The legacy of Leopold II is a reminder of the devastating impact of colonialism and imperialism, and the actions continue to be a source of tension and reflection, particularly in Belgium and the Democratic Republic of the Congo. So therefore, King Leopold II of Belgium stands as one of the most controversial and significant figures in the history of colonialism. His reign over the Congo Free State marked an era of unprecedented exploitation and suffering of the Congolese people. Despite his role in the modernization of Belgium, his legacy is inextricably linked to one of the darkest chapters in the history of European imperialism. The brutal practices of the Congo Free State and their enduring impact of the Congo and the people remain lasting reminding of the deep scars of colonial exploitation. So, a very dark chapter. Perhaps if he had even more colonial aspirations, if he had more regions, he would have caused more harm. But they've taken down and defaced some of his statues, but a challenging figure. And perhaps, for example, we paired this with one of the Axis powers. We could compare the destruction with some of the atrocities during World War II, for example, in Nazi Germany. So that is King Leopold II and the Belgian colonial empire. As for the content of the slide, so it's also known as Colonies Belges in Français and Belgisch Kolonien in Dutch, which was a secondary language, but primarily was French, because they achieved their freedom from the Dutch previously. It was the Belgian-controlled territories and concessions during the colonial era. Significant leader we highlighted was King Leopold II. The empire was the Belgian colonial empire. The period was from 1908 to 1962 CE, Common Era, during the colonial era. And modern locations included Belgium, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Rwanda, Burundi, China, for example, Tianjin, and parts of Antarctica as well. A million square kilometers would be 2.47, so quite large. Our average empire size is 1.14, so over double our average empire size. It must be noted that the DRC, Democratic Republic of the Congo region, was 80 times their Belgian holdings, so significant expansion. Million square miles would be 0.95. Percent of the world would be 1.83, excluding Antarctica. Capital was Brussels. The government was a constitutional monarchy. Common languages included French was the primary language, and Dutch was the secondary language as well. Religion was Roman Catholicism officially. Population was about 35 million, including the populations of its colonial territories, as an estimate. In terms of images, in the top left we have an image of King Leopold II himself. To the right of that we have the flag of the Belgian colonial empire. To the right of that we have the coat of arms. I always suggest zooming in and seeing the imagery that might be significant as to what are valued. For example, they have lions. That might seem more as a violent, for example, animal than, for example, a deer or something like that. So you can learn a little bit about the empire through, I believe, through looking at coats of arms. To the right of that, we have the Place Royale, or the Koningsplein, in the late 19th century, or the seat of government. Below that, we have an episode of the Belgian Revolution in 1830 by a beautiful painting, in my opinion, by Gustave Rappers in 1834, where Brussels became the capital of the new nation, achieving freedom from the Dutch. And then to the right of that, we have the famous 1927 Solvay conference in Brussels. It was the 5th World Physics Conference. You can see Einstein here, but there are countless other famous physicists and scientists in that image as well, so showing the sort of interconnectedness of Europe even during this time. Some important dates: the annexation of the Congo Free State was in 1908, the annexation of Rwanda-Urundi was in 1916, the independence of the Congo was achieved in 1960, and the independence of Rwanda and Burundi was on the 1st of July 1962. Here we have the map. We have the Belgium up here. We have the Congo, as we can see, it's over 80 times the size. Rwanda, Urundi here, and the Belgian concession of Tianjin and China over there as well. So that closes off our colonial empires, and actually our last empire we'll be covering in this series. And now we move to our final comparison between leaders. So, comparison between Emperor Meiji and King Leopold II. So Emperor Meiji was born on November 3rd, 1852. King Leopold was born on April 9th, 1835. So relatively close to each other, but King Leopold was born slightly earlier, less than 20 years earlier. Emperor Meiji ascended to the throne in 1867 at the age of 14 following the death of his father, Emperor Komei. King Leopold, following the death of his father, came to the throne when he was in 1865, when he was 30 years old, so coming to power later. Father King Leopold I. But King Leopold II's father had relatively more powers than Emperor Meiji's powers, because it was under him that he formed the empire, whereas King Leopold II, his Belgian empire was created. However, the empire period when they claimed control of the Congo, the significant expansion though was during King Leopold II's time. So we might consider them both the founders of their empires, and they both did come from royal lineage, but King Leopold I's father, well, both of their fathers were quite powerful, but there was the shogunate during Emperor Meiji's father's time. So, whereas there was no, his father Belgium had already achieved freedom from the Dutch by the time King Leopold II's father had come to power. As for their rise to power, Meiji's rise to power occurred at a time of significant internal unrest, and Japan was forced to open up the Western world, and the feudal Tokugawa shogunate was in decline. His reign marks the beginning of the Meiji Restoration in 1868, a period that restored imperial rule and laid the foundation for Japan's modernization. As for Leopold II, he became king of a relatively small, newly independent Belgium. So, not first, but newly independent. He sought to elevate Belgium's status on the international stage and decided to pursue colonial ambitions in Africa. So both had international ambitions, conquering ambitions. Unlike Meiji, Leopold's reign was largely defined by his personal ambition to create a colonial empire, specifically in the Congo. As for their approach to governance, as for Emperor Meiji, his vision, Emperor Meiji, alongside his advisors, embraced in a broad vision of modernization and industrialization. His reign witnessed the Meiji Restoration, which transformed Japan from a feudal society into a modern industrial empire. The empire's government centralized power, abolished the samurai class, the shogunate, introduced constitutional reforms, and sought to create a strong, centralized state. As for King Leopold II's vision, Leopold II's approach was motivated by imperial expansion and economic profit, personal profit, however. His main objective was to acquire colonies, and he viewed the Congo as a source of immense wealth. Although Leopold presented himself as a philanthropist and humanitarian seeking to bring civilization to Africa, his true motives were focused on exploitation and wealth accumulation through rubber and mineral extraction. As for reforms under Emperor Meiji's Japan introduced Western-style institutions, a bicameral house, for example, including a constitution, parliamentary system, bicameral system, and a modern economy. He reformed the military education system and economy, and he reformed the military education and legal code as well, aiming to make Japan competitive with Western powers. Meiji's leadership was marked by a desire for progress and to ensure Japan would not follow under foreign domination. As for reforms under King Leopold II, unlike Meiji, Leopold did not pursue internal reforms for his country's development on as great of a scale. His focus was primarily external, so Meiji had both the internal and external, for example, the Sino-Japanese War and the Russo-Japanese Wars, whereas King Leopold was focused predominantly on external factors. Therefore, King Leopold II was primarily focused on the Congo Free State, which he ruled privately for personal gain. So Emperor Meiji might also be characterized as sharing his power with the parliament, whereas King Leopold II was created a state without sharing it with Belgium, taking it for himself, so another difference there. While he modernized Belgium in some respects, such as infrastructure development, his legacy is overshadowed by the atrocities in the Congo. As for their impact on their nations, for modernization, Emperor Meiji is credited with transforming Japan from a closed, feudal society into a major industrial power. His efforts resulted in significant economic growth, the establishment of a modern infrastructure, and a powerful military. This transformation allowed Japan to assert itself as a global power in the early 20th century. As for King Leopold II, as mentioned, colonial exploitation. King Leopold II's Congo Free State became synonymous with exploitation, brutality, and atrocities. His economic policies in the Congo led to the death of millions of people, of Congolese, due to forced labor, violence, and disease, and Leopold's regime is one of the most infamous examples of colonial cruelty. As for national unity under Meiji, Meiji reforms fostered national unity, blending Western practices with traditional Japanese values, and Japan successfully avoided colonization by Western powers, whereas some of its peers were not as successful, thanks in large part to the strength of the Meiji state. As for long-term impact under Emperor Meiji, the legacy of Meiji's rule includes Japan's rise as a world power, and later its role in both World War I and later under different leadership under World War II. But he laid the groundwork for these wars, and he laid the groundwork for Japan's eventual imperial expansion in Asia. As for national impact for King Leopold II, Leopold's reign did not lead to significant internal reforms for Belgium, as mentioned. Although his personal wealth grew immensely from the Congo, Belgium's position in Europe was not dramatically altered by his colonial pursuits. However, the Belgian Congo, established in 1908, became a significant colonial asset for Belgium, although it continued to exploit the colony's people. So eventually, when it did become part of Belgium, it did drastically increase the size and eventually brought wealth to Belgium, but still at the cost or the expense of the Congolese people. As for his legacy, Leopold's legacy, once again, is one of infamy. While Belgium benefited economically from the Congo, the atrocities committed under his rule left a dark stain on the nation's history, which Belgium has increasingly confronted in recent years. As for colonialism and imperialism, under Meiji, Japan's imperialism was state-sponsored and largely pursued in the context of Japan's desire to assert itself as a major power in East Asia. Japan's victories in the First Sino-Japanese War under Emperor Meiji from 1894 to 1895 and the Russo-Japanese War from 1904 to 1905 were part of Japan's rise as a global military and economic power. Japan sought Korea, Taiwan, and later parts of Manchuria as part of its imperial expansion. As for his focus on sovereignty, unlike Leopold's private exploitation of the Congo, Japan's imperial actions were framed as part of a broader national project to maintain sovereignty in a world dominated by Western powers. This drove Japan to adopt modern military, economic, and legal systems, or economy systems and legal systems, or modern economy, pardon me. As for King Leopold II, once again, it was private colonialism, so a difference there, certainly. Leopold's approach was entirely driven by personal financial gain. The Congo Free State was his private property, and he exploited resources for his own profit. Unlike Japan's state-driven imperialism, Leopold's colonial project was marked by his autocratic control and brutal treatment of the Congolese people. As for the humanitarian facade as well, whereas Emperor Meiji truly did have a focus on sovereignty, King Leopold II also hid his with a humanitarian facade. Leopold disguised his actions with a humanitarian narrative, claiming he was ending the slave trade and bringing the civilization to the Congo. In reality, his administration led to human rights abuses and the exploitation of the Congolese people for rubber and ivory extraction. As for their ethical and moral differences, with the modernization and national focus under Emperor Meiji's reforms, while aggressive in their embrace of Western technology and ideas, were aimed at ensuring Japan's self-preservation and strength, but still an open society. Japan's colonial actions, particularly after Meiji's deaths, were aimed at securing regional dominance, but were framed with the context of national defense and self-determination. As for his legacy of progress, despite his later militarism that emerged after his reign, Meiji's legacy is largely viewed as one of modernization and national empowerment, with some expansionism, with Japan's emerging as an industrial and military powerhouse by the early 20th century. As for King Leopold II, he was focused on colonialism or expansionism. Leopold's rule in the Congo was an example of colonial exploitation. The human rights abuses that occurred under his rule were among the most brutal in colonial history. Under his legacy is therefore marred by the suffering of the Congolese people. As for his legacy, as alluded to, Leopold's legacy is a reminder of the devastating impact of imperialism driven by greed and racial superiority. We can see parallels with our Nazi empire. His actions led to the death of millions of people and caused long-lasting harm in the Congo, some impacts still existing today, leaving a legacy of trauma and exploitation that the Congo continue to deal with today. So therefore, in comparison, Emperor Meiji of the Empire of Japan and King Leopold II of the Belgian Colonial Empire, we see two very different approaches to governance and imperialism. Emperor Meiji is remembered for his successful efforts to modernize Japan, ensuring its survival and emergence as a world power. His reforms and policies fostered national unity, progress, and a balance between traditional Japanese values and modern institutions. In stark contrast, King Leopold II is remembered for his brutal exploitation of the Congo, driven by personal gain rather than national ambition. While he contributed to Belgium's wealth, the human toll of his reign is profound, with millions of Congolese losing their lives under his control. Leopold's legacy is largely viewed as with condemnation due to the atrocities committed in the Congo, overshadowing any positive effects his rule may have had in Belgium itself, and therefore they've knocked down some of his statues and defaced some of his statues even. Therefore, while Meiji's legacy can be seen as one of empowerment and modernization, Leopold's reign serves as a grim reminder of the destructive effects of unchecked colonialism and personal greed. So two very starkly different leaders, but both had a similar engagement with expansionism, which is by virtue and necessity for an empire. So that is the very last episode of Ages of Empires. This is Cashcroft TV. My name is Kaylin Ashcroft. Thank you very much for your support. It's been quite a journey. I wasn't sure if we'd ever make it here, but we have. There have times, there have been breaks, there have been lots of efforts. In fact, this is the most difficult thing I do, from the speaking and the research behind it makes everything else I do seem quite easy. So I'm very grateful for your support. I wouldn't have done it if it weren't for you, and I'd be very grateful if you continue to support. So thank you so much. On to the next adventure.